There are people who love so quietly that even their absence feels gentle. They give without being asked, anticipate needs before words form, and hold the pain of others as if it were their own heartbeat. To them, care is not a choice. It's a reflex, a way of existing. But beneath that tenderness lies something unspoken, the slow disappearance of self. They have learned that love is proven through sacrifice, that peace is kept through silence, and that to be good is to be small. This is not weakness, it's survival. A pattern born long ago, when love felt safest only when it didn't ask for anything in return. This is the story of those who care until they vanish. It doesn't happen all at once. The fading begins softly, like colors losing their warmth at dusk. At first, it looks like love, like thoughtfulness, like the natural instinct to care. You remember birthdays, listen without interrupting, carry the emotional weight others don't even notice they've handed you. You are dependable, attentive kind. People call it empathy. But over time, it starts to feel like something else. A quiet, unspoken rule forms in your mind. If I am not needed, I might not be loved. So you keep showing up, even when you're tired. You keep saying yes, even when every part of you whispers no. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your edges begin to blur. You start to measure your worth not by how you feel, but by how much comfort you provide. The emotional temperature of a room becomes your mirror. If everyone else is calm, you feel safe. If someone is hurt, you feel responsible. Somewhere along the way, your own needs start to feel intrusive. You edit yourself before speaking. You soften your tone, your opinions, your presence, until only gentleness remains. A gentleness so constant it begins to erase you. You tell yourself you're just being considerate, but deep down, there's fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as too much. You've learned that harmony is more important than honesty. That peace is worth any personal silence, and so you start disappearing. Not in the dramatic way people imagine. No grand exits, no visible collapse. It's quieter than that. You vanish in small ways, in the moments you smile instead of speak, in the apologies you offer for simply existing, in the way your joy becomes secondary to someone else's comfort. People rarely notice this kind of disappearance. To the outside world, you look kind, reliable, emotionally mature. They praise you for your patience, your understanding, your ability to stay calm. But inside, you know the truth. You've built an identity around being safe for others, not known by them. You're surrounded by people, yet rarely seen. Even your closest relationships may unknowingly depend on your invisibility. The moment you try to take up space, to express anger, sadness, or need, the balance shifts. The room grows uncomfortable. You sense disappointment, withdrawal, or confusion in others' faces, and you retreat again. It's easier to be invisible than to risk losing love. Psychologists call this the fawn response. It's a survival mechanism, an adaptive form of people-pleasing rooted in early experiences of conditional safety. But when repeated over years, it becomes a pattern of self-erasure. A person learns to protect themselves not through distance or defiance, but through endless accommodation. Care becomes currency. The more you give, the safer you feel. The more you disappear, the more peace you keep. Until one day, you look in the mirror and realize you no longer recognize the person reflected back. There is warmth, but no clarity. There is empathy, but no self. Your life feels full of connection, yet starved of intimacy. And this is how it begins, the quiet disappearance. 1,000 small surrenders disguised as kindness. a lifetime of being loved for how softly you vanish. You tell yourself it's noble, that it's love. But beneath that belief lies a truth too heavy to admit. You've mistaken self-abandonment for care. Because somewhere in your story, you learned that to love is to leave yourself behind. Every pattern has a birthplace. Before it becomes identity, it begins as adaptation, small adjustments made in the quiet corners of childhood. For those who confuse care with self-erasure, the lesson often starts early. It doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it's born from subtle emotional imbalances, the moments when love was present but not attuned. Perhaps it began with parents who were overwhelmed, distracted, or unpredictable. Maybe affection came only when you behaved, stayed quiet, or anticipated what others needed before they asked. You learned, without words, that being loved required being easy. That comfort came not from being seen, but from being useful. Children are astonishingly perceptive. They notice the sigh in a parent's voice, the tension that fills a room, the way attention shifts when they cry or complain. So they adapt. They read emotions before they read words. They learn to monitor, to please, to soothe. It becomes instinctual, the small child scanning faces for approval, adjusting tone, dimming excitement, erasing frustration. Each time they succeed in keeping peace, the brain registers relief, safety, love. A neurological bond forms between care and a survival. And so, by the time this child grows, their nervous system has learned an invisible truth. To be safe, I must not need too much. There are many ways this lesson takes shape. Sometimes it's the eldest child who becomes the emotional caretaker of the family, praised for maturity while quietly deprived of childhood. Sometimes it's the sensitive one, the peacekeeper, who learns to hold space for everyone else's chaos. Sometimes it's the neglected one who realizes that being helpful earns more attention than being hurt. These are not conscious choices. They're emotional contracts written in silence. No one explicitly says, "You must disappear to be loved." But the message is delivered through patterns. Through the relief in a parent's eyes when you stop crying, the affection that returns when you make yourself small, the love that feels conditional on how little trouble you cause. And so you grow up believing that being good means being quiet. That kindness is synonymous with self-control. That expressing need is dangerous, that it makes people turn away. The child becomes an adult who listens deeply but rarely speaks honestly, who can comfort others effortlessly but feels uneasy when comforted, who feels most secure when others are at ease, even if it costs their own peace. This is not merely emotional behavior. It's a survival system wired into the body. Your nervous system begins to associate self-sacrifice with safety. Every small act of suppression feels like protection. Every time you shrink to keep the peace, your brain whispers you did well. You're safe again. But what the body calls safety, the soul begins to call loneliness. It's important to understand that these beginnings are not about blame. Parents who struggled to love fully were often carrying their own invisible burdens, their own versions of self-erasure. The pattern repeats across generations, passed down not through words but through emotional habits. A mother who could not rest until everyone else was fine. A father who spoke only through action, never through affection. A home that valued harmony over honesty. You watched, you learned, you inherited. And what you inherited was not just a way of loving others, but a way of losing yourself inside them. This is where it begins. In the silence of early years. In the spaces where your needs were too heavy for the room. In the moments you felt love only when you disappeared just enough to make someone else comfortable. You didn't choose this pattern. You became it. And even now, as an adult, a part of you still believes that to be loved, you must stay small enough not to disturb the peace. Caring, in its purest form, is one of the most beautiful human instincts. It connects us, sustains us, and allows empathy to translate into action. But when care becomes the only way we feel worthy, it stops being connection and starts becoming a quiet form of control, a way to manage fear, guilt, or uncertainty. For those who learned early that love must be earned, care is not generosity. It's self-preservation. Every act of giving carries a hidden motive. Please don't leave. Please stay. It isn't manipulation, not consciously. It's survival through service. Psychologically, this pattern often sits at the intersection of usars attachment and fear. Those with an anxious or fawning attachment style are deeply attuned to others' emotional states. They sense tension before it's expressed, discomfort before it's spoken. The nervous system, conditioned to detect rejection, leaps into repair mode. Fix it. Soften it. Make it better. In these moments, care is no longer a choice, it's compulsion. To not help feels unsafe. To rest feels selfish. To say no feels like betrayal. The mind begins to blur the line between caring and disappearing. You might say yes when you mean maybe. You might stay awake to listen to someone's pain, even when you have none of your own energy left. You might cancel your plans to help someone through a crisis, and then tell yourself you wanted to, because wanting it feels safer than admitting you felt obligated. Neuroscience explains this too. The same brain circuits involved in empathy and caregiving, the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, light up when we sense others in distress. In securely attached people, this activation leads to compassion balanced by boundaries. But in overcarers, the regulation system is missing. They don't stop at feeling with someone. They begin to feel for them, as if another's pain were a personal responsibility. The body translates emotional imbalance into urgency. Heart rate rises. Muscles tighten. The instinct to do something overrides the ability to pause and reflect. In this way, care becomes a physiological addiction. The relief of being needed releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter tied to reward and pleasure. Every time you help, you feel momentarily valuable. Every time you fix, you feel seen. And so, the cycle continues: give more, feel needed, feel safe, lose self-care, repeat. Yet behind every overcarer is a deep fear of irrelevancies. They fear that if they stop tending, others will stop staying. The idea of being loved without effort feels foreign, unearned, even suspicious. So they function in relationships, trying to keep balance through constant emotional labor. The paradox is cruel: the more they care, the more invisible they become. Because to those around them, care is expected. It's the air they breathe. And when something becomes constant, it stops being noticed. From a psychological lens, this is also a boundary disorder. Boundaries are not walls, they're the edges of selfhood. But when someone's early environment punished expression or autonomy, those edges blur. They don't know where their emotions end and others begin. So when a loved one is sad, they feel it as their own sadness. When someone is angry, they feel it as personal failure. Their emotional mirror has no frame. In therapy, clinicians often describe this as enmeshment, a state where caring turns into merging and compassion into compliance. It's empathy without anchor. Overcare sounds noble, but it quietly corrodes authenticity. Because to maintain peace, You start editing the truth. You become agreeable instead of honest, generous instead of real. And while everyone sees your kindness, few see the exhaustion that hums beneath it. You think you're choosing love, but often it's fear disguised as devotion. The fear that if you stop carrying others, you'll be dropped yourself. This is the psychology of overcare love, warped by survival. Empathy, stretched into exhaustion. The heart, doing too much to prove it deserves to exist. And though it begins in kindness, it always ends the same way, with the quiet ache of someone who has given everything except permission to simply be. There comes a point when silence begins to ache. Not the kind of silence that soothes, but the kind that swells heavy and unspoken, pressing against the ribs like withheld breath. For those who've spent years tending to others, their own needs become ghosts, felt but never named. They hover in the background of every interaction, faint as whispers beneath polite smiles. It's not that they don't have needs. It's that somewhere along the way, they learn those needs inconvenience others. That to want too much is to risk losing what little warmth they have. So they learn to ration themselves, to speak half truths and quiet longings, to translate hunger into patience, desire into restraint. They learn to survive on emotional crumbs and call it enough. Psychologists call this learned invisibility, a pattern where unmet needs are repressed to preserve attachment. It's a survival adaptation that once protected them from rejection, but now perpetuates loneliness, because to stay connected, they edit themselves. And every time they suppress a truth, the connection becomes less real. They become fluent in the emotional language of others, but illiterate in their own. They know when someone is tired, anxious, distant. They can sense tension from a single shift in tone. Yet when asked how they feel, they hesitate. They scan the room, searching for a safe answer. The truth, if spoken, feels dangerous, too raw, too heavy, too much. So they say, "I'm fine," even when something inside them is quietly breaking. The tragedy of unspoken needs is that they don't disappear. They accumulate subtle, shapeless, and unresolved. Each swallowed word, each unexpressed desire, adds another stone to the invisible weight they carry. Eventually, that weight becomes the very fabric of their personality. They mistake numbness for calm. They confuse detachment with maturity. They call it emotional control, when in truth, it's emotional starvation. They might look stable from the outside, always listening, always calm, always available. But inside, there's a fatigue that never seems to lift. A quiet ache that whispers, "When will someone care for me the way I care for them?" This inner conflict is profound. On one side is the yearning to be seen, to finally exhale. On the other is the terror of being misunderstood or dismissed. To express a need feels like a gamble. What if they pull away? What if they think you're selfish? What if your longing breaks the illusion that you're the strong one? So you keep the peace, even when it costs your truth. You carry everyone's emotions, yet have nowhere to set down your own. It's a strange form of loneliness, surrounded by people, yet starved of intimacy. Not because others don't care, but because you've trained them not to. Over time, this quiet suppression manifests physically. The body speaks when the voice cannot, tension in the shoulders, exhaustion that no rest can fix, the dull ache of holding too much for too long. Your nervous system has learned to hold back tears, as if they're dangerous. Even moments of tenderness can feel foreign. Your chest tightens, unsure how to receive softness without guilt. You want to be seen, but you also flinch at the thought of it. because being seen means being known. And being known might mean being rejected. This is the paradox of those who erase themselves. They crave connection, yet fear the vulnerability it requires. They want to be cared for, but only if it doesn't inconvenience anyone. They've built a life on quiet endurance, on carrying the emotional weight no one asked them to hold. But every unspoken need has a pulse, and it doesn't fade. It waits to be acknowledged, waits to be spoken, waits for the moment when care can finally flow both ways. At first, it's not a dramatic revelation. It's quiet, almost disappointing in its simplicity. The moment of recognition often arrives when exhaustion becomes heavier than fear, when you realize that no amount of giving seems to bring the peace you've been chasing. When the people you've carried for years still feel distant, and your care, no matter how constant, no longer fills the emptiness inside you. It doesn't come as anger. It comes as stillness, a pause between breaths where you notice how much of yourself has been spent maintaining everyone else's comfort. You see it suddenly, like light breaking through a fog. You have mistaken love for labor. This is the moment the illusion begins to crack. For the first time, you notice how your compassion has become a cage. How the person who always listens is rarely heard. How you've been living in emotional debt, offering tenderness you never allow yourself to receive. You start to question things you never dared to before. Why does saying no make your chest tighten? Why does rest feel like guilt? Why do you apologize when someone else is unkind? These are not small questions. They're the first signs of awakening. Psychologically, this moment represents a shift from as far as Fawn's awareness. In trauma research, the fawn response is a survival mechanism. Appease, please, accommodate, to prevent conflict or abandonment. But recognition is when the mind begins to distinguish between then and on now. You begin to see that the danger is no longer present. You are not that helpless child anymore, waiting for approval. You are an adult, capable of surviving rejection, of enduring discomfort, of choosing truth over peacekeeping. This realization can feel liberating and terrifying, because once you see the pattern, you can no longer unsee it. Every interaction becomes a mirror. You start noticing how often you shrink to make others comfortable, how often you volunteer for emotional labor that no one asked you to do. It's not resentment you feel, it's grief. Grief for the years spent trying to earn what should have been unconditional. Grief for the self that existed only in relation to others. Grief for the person you could have been, had you not learned to disappear. This grief is sacred. It's the mind mourning its own misunderstanding of love. It's the body releasing the tension of decades spent bracing for disapproval. At this stage, you may find yourself pulling back, spending more time alone, feeling distant from relationships that once defined you. It's not isolation, it's recalibration. You are learning the difference between solitude and emptiness, between peace and suppression. Recognition does not mean instant change. Old patterns resist extinction. They whisper, be careful. Don't upset them. Don't risk it. You will feel guilt for doing less. You will worry that you're becoming selfish. You will test small boundaries and then retreat, questioning your right to them. But each time you pause before saying yes, each time you allow discomfort to exist without fixing it, you grow. This is how healing begins, not in grand gestures, but in quiet refusals. The moment of recognition is not a single event, it's a slow unfolding, a dawning awareness that care, in its truest form, must include you too. And somewhere deep in that realization lies the first honest breath you've taken in years. It's not the end of caring. It's the beginning of caring now without disappearing. Because to love fully is not to vanish. It is to remain present, whole, and seen. Healing does not arrive with fanfare. It comes in fragments, small, almost unnoticeable moments when you choose yourself quietly. You wake up one morning and feel the weight of a familiar urge to fix, to please, to soften. But this time, you pause. You let the silence stretch instead of rushing to fill it. You take a breath that belongs entirely to you. That is the beginning. Reclaiming the self after years of self-erasure is not about becoming harder or indifferent. It's about remembering that you exist beyond usefulness. That your worth isn't measured in how easy you are to love, but in the fact that you weigh Ari. For those who've spent a lifetime tending to others, this realization can feel foreign, even disorienting. The body doesn't know what to do with unclaimed space. Stillness feels like guilt, freedom feels like loss. But this discomfort is the soil of transformation. Because before you can build a new way of being, you must sit inside the emptiness left by the old one. In therapy, this stage is often called a healthy differentiation, the process of learning where you end and others begin. It means recognizing that your emotions are your own, that your peace is not dependent on someone else's calm, and that love cannot survive if it demands your disappearance. It's not easy. Boundaries feel cruel at first. You worry that saying, "No," makes you cold. You wonder if choosing solitude means you've failed at connection. But slowly, you begin to see boundaries for what they really are, not walls, but doors, ways to let people in ours without losing yourself in the process. You start small. You allow yourself to disappoint someone. You tell a truth that trembles in your throat. You resist the urge to over-explain. At first, it feels unbearable. The silence that follows, the fear of rejection that rises like a wave. But when no disaster comes, when the world doesn't collapse, something shifts. You realize that love can survive honesty. And maybe, for the first time, so can you. This is self-compassion in its rawest form. Not the soft language of comfort, but the fierce decision to stop betraying yourself for belonging. Psychologically, reclaiming the self is a reprogramming of the nervous system. The body, once trained to equate stillness with danger, begins to learn that peace can be safe. Moments of self-focus, reading, resting, reflecting, no longer trigger guilt but gratitude. Your empathy remains, but it's grounded now. You listen without dissolving, care without collapsing. You still love deeply, but you no longer confuse sacrifice with sincerity. And when people begin to pull away, those who preferred your silence, your endless availability, you let them. Because you finally understand that losing others is not the same as losing yourself. Healing is rarely graceful. You'll stumble between old habits and new boundaries, between guilt and relief. There will be days when you want to return to what's familiar, even if it hurts. But each time you choose authenticity over approval, you reclaim another piece of yourself. You begin to occupy your life again, not as a caretaker, but as a person. Not as an echo of someone else's comfort, but as a voice that belongs entirely to you. Reclaiming the self is not a return to who you were before. It's the discovery of who you've always been beneath the fear. The one who could love without vanishing. The one who could stay without surrendering the space they stand in. There is a rare kind of peace that comes when you stop trying to deserve your own existence. When you no longer measure your worth by what you offer, fix, or provide. when you realize that simply breathing, thinking, and being, quietly, imperfectly, is enough. For those who've lived as caretakers of everyone but themselves, this realization feels almost holy. Because for the first time, you are not performing calm. You are not earning love. You are simply here. You existing without earning it is not about detachment or indifference. It's about belonging to yourself first, so that love, when it comes, meets you as an equal, not as a rescuer or a savior. In this space, you begin to understand the difference between a selfishness and a selfhood. Selfishness takes from others. Selfhood returns to the self. It's the act of coming home to your own emotions, of sitting beside your own needs with kindness instead of shame. You no longer rush to fill every silence. You don't chase validation in every relationship. You learn to let others carry their own discomfort. And something miraculous happens. The world doesn't collapse when you stop holding it. Psychologically, this stage represents verge integration, the final phase of healing where awareness and action align. Your nervous system begins to trust safety in stillness. You stop scanning for emotional danger because you finally understand that you are no longer living in the conditions that once demanded hyper-vigilance. Love begins to feel softer, lighter. You can listen to someone's pain without merging with it. You can offer care without dissolving into it. You can give without disappearing. This balance, the ability to stay connected via intact, is what genuine empathy was always meant to be. But perhaps the most profound change is internal. You begin to look at yourself with the same compassion you've always reserved for others. You see the tenderness in your own survival. The way you loved as a means to stay safe. The way you gave because you didn't know another way to keep love near. And instead of shame, you feel gratitude. Because that pattern, though costly, once kept you alive. Now, it's simply time to evolve beyond it. You start to notice beauty again, in the smallest things. The stillness of morning light, the warmth of solitude, the comfort of doing something just because it pleases you, not because it serves anyone else. You stop apologizing for resting. You stop defending your boundaries. You stop explaining your worth. The silence that once felt unbearable now feels sacred, a sanctuary where you can finally hear yourself think. This is what existing without earning it feels like, a quiet confidence that does not need permission to breathe. A self-love that is not loud or performative, but steady like a pulse. From a poetic lens, it is the return of wholeness. The realization that you were never meant to vanish in order to be loved. That real connection begins when you no longer disappear to maintain it. You understand now that care, to be complete, must include both giver and receiver. That love, to be true, cannot demand the loss of self. And so, you begin to live differently. Not as the caretaker who bends until breaking, but as the human who can stand still, breathe deeply, and know that their existence alone is enough reason to be loved. You were never too much. You were simply trying to survive in a world that mistook silence for kindness. But now you know. To exist, to rest, to speak, to feel. You don't need to earn it. You only need to allow it.